Okay, we should be good right now. Bismarck, hi, thank you. Um, Almost done. Let me minimize this screen. Okay, we should be good to go. Now, tonight's study, I think, is one you might find interesting, Lord willing. It is a review, a study I had shared some time ago called the Curse of the Cross. And then I've renamed it here. Carries the same message pretty much, I think. Bearing the cross. Now, what happens? What do we think of when we read verses in the Bible, for example, that speak of taking up one's cross and following Christ? What comes to mind at first glance? Long suffering, physical persecution. That's what I normally think of. But I think today, by God's grace, we begin to see something very interesting. And that's not surprising, of course, because it seems pretty much all that we're looking at in the Bible today was ultimately pointing to the Great Tribulation, God's judgment on the church, and then the separation, right? So what I'm going to offer here tonight, what I'll offer is that judgment, that's the Great Tribulation, the church body is on a tree. To be hung on a tree is to be under the curse of God. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22. If a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree. Notice the next verse. His body shall not remain all night upon the tree. And that verse didn't post. I have to break it up. Hold on. His body would not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. Just look at this verse carefully and tell me what you think, looking at the language. Remember, God, I believe he buries the spiritual meaning in these verses. And as soon as we see the word bury, what comes to mind? What does burial typically identify with in the Bible? His body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that the land be not defiled. Salvation, yeah, to be buried with Christ. And we're going to look at that a little bit further in a few minutes. But just looking at the language here, I began to suspect, by God's grace, that God is giving us a picture of the church coming into the Great Tribulation. You know, we've said in the past that God speaks of the church as a man, a body, one body, which is actually made up of all those who profess Christ. Mark chapter 11, verse 21, where God cursed the fig tree. Peter, calling to remembrance, saith unto him, Master, behold the fig tree. What about the fig tree? What is that pointing to spiritually? Is that speaking only of the nation of Israel? Wouldn't the fig tree again be looking at the church today, right? Babylon, the fig tree, the corporate body, I think was really typifying. In a historical account, it was looking at the nation of Israel. But these things were written for our admonition. So therefore, I believe the fig tree would have typified the church. and God cursed the fig tree. So coming under the curse of God, today we see this in tribulation. Also in Genesis chapter 40 verse 19, we read about the butler and the baker. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree. Talking about the chief baker, those who offended their Lord. And the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. So again, if we look at the account of the butler and the baker carefully, we'll see, Lord willing, that it is a picture of the church, again, in tribulation. One is judged, one is cursed, like the baker here. And the butler, he was restored. Remember that? He was restored unto service. And that, I believe, would have been a picture of the believers coming out of tribulation. Thomas, okay, you have sound? Okay, now let's take a look at the language surrounding the cross, surrounding the judgment on Christ at the cross. Christ hanging on a tree as he endured the cross. Hebrews chapter 12 verse 2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. Now that's an interesting word, endure, because God, I think, uses it a number of times, and we're going to see this when it comes to the believers being refined in tribulation. So Christ endured the cross. He was the first to be judged on behalf of the believers. Acts chapter 5 verse 30. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom ye slew and hanged on a tree. Christ was hung on a tree, meaning that he was under the judgment of God. He was cursed of God. Numbers 21 verse 9. Moses made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. What was that a picture of? What do you suppose that was a picture of? Remember the church in the wilderness? God's judgment came on the people. He allowed serpents to bite the people in the camp. And then when they cried to God, he told Moses that he was to make a serpent of brass and put that on a pole. Anything come to mind looking at that account? If I be lifted up from the earth, that's a good verse. I think that relates. Then will I draw all men to myself. What verse is that? If I be lifted up. I'll have to incorporate that verse there. Yeah, John chapter 12 verse 32. Yeah, that serpent there, I believe, would be pointing to Christ. And the serpents that were biting the people is a picture of the locusts, the false prophets, the unsaved in the church that God allows to destroy them. Again, in tribulation, when the man of sin takes his seat in the temple. And then Christ now, who is also said to be a serpent in this context, was asked to be put on a pole. In other words, on the cross. And those who look to that, the elect, the believers, they were spared. They were not bitten. Isn't that a beautiful picture of salvation? Right? Rose, hi, welcome. We're looking at bearing the cross, a review study previously called The Curse of the Cross. What I'm trying to relate here, Lord willing, is how no problem. I'm trying to relate here is that how the church, or to be hung on the cross, is really a picture of God's judgment on the church in tribulation. And then the believers, they're not to remain, the body of Christ is not going to remain on the cross all night. Very beautiful picture of salvation, I believe. Okay, so now, if I be lifted up from the earth, will I draw all men to myself. And I think that that does relate to Numbers 21 verse 9. Galatians chapter 3 verse 13. Christ have redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree. Christ was cursed when he hung on the cross. The church is cursed coming into the Great Tribulation. Spiritually, it is said to be on a cross. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 16, that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. Philippians chapter 2 verse 8, being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Now, it's kind of interesting here because we read about the second death in the book of Revelation. And so when God is speaking of death, he also has in view the cross. Those that are hung on a tree. Colossians chapter 1 verse 20, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Here's another interesting reference, I think. Notice how God is tying in blood to the cross. Do you suppose it's because Christ was whipped and then he shed physical blood or literal blood before the cross? I don't think blood here, at least not the literal blood, is what's in view. I think God is tying in blood to the cross because blood has to do with death. Remember, there's an account, I think, in the Old Testament where God says that the life of the flesh is where? Where is the life of the flesh? The life of the flesh is in the blood. Yeah, exactly, Bismarck. When you drain, when you drain the blood from someone, then in essence you are killing them, right? You take away their life. And that's another picture I think God is giving us when it comes to what happens to the church in tribulation. Because they shed blood, the blood of the martyrs, the believers, God sheds their blood. And if their blood is shed, then it means they are going to die. So it is kind of interesting here, I think, that how God is actually tying in blood to the cross. Mitchell writes, hold on one second, Mitchell. Yeah, and also in Hebrews chapter 9 verse 22 we read that without the shedding of blood there is no remission. Ronnie writes, the church body dying, that makes a lot of... Right, exactly. Jesus said, you must drink my blood and eat my flesh. Yeah. And is it possible that because God drains the blood of the church, and so therefore the believers, they need blood in order to live? So that there might be a connection there. Thanks for sharing that. So without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. That's another verse here, I think. I thought I had, but I'll have to incorporate that. Okay, now Colossians chapter 2 verse 14. Blotting out. He emptied himself of what? Of his blood or of himself? Right. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. The cross is where Christ makes atonement for the elect. Now, take a look at this verse here in John chapter 19, verse 30. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. Well, that's interesting because he was still alive, wasn't he? Would this prove that the death of Christ or redemption in the cross was not really looking at a physical death, was it? Because here he says it is finished, and yet he was still alive. So it's not the fact that he literally died. So it seems to indicate here that he'd made payment for sin at the time, even before the cross, right? You notice how I think there are those today that are trying to link physical death, the physical death of Christ, to the remission of the body, to the payment for sin. And that's probably why we also begin to hear about Christ dying before the foundation of the world to make payment for sin. Alright, but we'll come back to that. Now, tribulation, the believers, they came into this time. They too, they were under the wrath of God. Not in the sense that they would be condemned, but in the sense that God was hiding his face from the whole church body. Make sense? So from that perspective, they had to endure. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Then said Jesus unto his disciples, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Again, these are some verses that for a long time you read these verses, they don't seem to add up to a whole lot. We try to relate, perhaps, I know I have, these verses to what's going on in my life. But notice here that God says that let him deny himself. What happened? What did the church do coming into the Great Tribulation? Don't we read about what happened with Peter? Didn't Peter deny Christ? And that was a picture, just like Judas, he betrayed Christ, is a picture of the church in tribulation. So God here appears to be saying that let them not deny Christ, let them deny himself. And the word himself there again, I think, is pointing to the church. Yeah, they worry about their own inheritance. Right, exactly. So they're not yeah, you're thinking of the other study, right, Bismarck? Lest I mar mine own inheritance like the rich man. Yeah, so that's a very good observation. So in order for them to become saved, they have to deny themselves, not Christ. And we're going to see this when God begins to speak of those that are saving their lives for the sake of Christ. So let him deny himself and take up his cross. Now I think today, by God's grace, this language carries more substance when we see how it is used in the context of the believers, a third part going through the fire. That's when I believe they had to endure, they had to bear the cross, because the idea of being on the cross means that one is cursed of God, right? The church in tribulation. Matthew 16:25, whosoever will save his life shall lose it. Who are they that are seeking to save their lives? The church, again, I propose. They kill the two witnesses, they say I am, they say peace and safety. So from that vantage point, they are giving up Christ, thinking that they have salvation. And whosoever will lose his life, the elect, they forsook all spiritually, and in so doing they find Christ, they find life. Matthew 16:27, the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with the holy angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. Again, I believe this is the language of salvation. Come out of her, my people. The crown of life, the reward that the believers receive, is the fact that God has unsealed the Bible to them, and now they are being redeemed. Luke chapter 14:27, whosoever doth not bear his cross, again, enduring to the end. Luke 23 verse 26. Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross. Wouldn't he be a picture or a type of the elect? That he might bear it after Jesus. I think that's pointing to, again, the believers enduring the cross and tribulation. Matthew chapter 10 verse 22. And ye shall be hated of all for my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end. What end is God talking about there? Is that the last day? I used to think it was. But if we allow the rest of the Bible, Lord willing, to speak to us, I think we begin to see that the end there is the end of the church age, the depart out, separation. The believers, they had to go through the fire. They endured the cross. And now when the end comes, Christ is revealed. Now it's the end. Babylon is fallen. God begins the separation. Romans chapter 12:12, rejoicing in hope, patient, that's enduring, patient in tribulation. 2 Timothy 2:12, if we suffer, that's patience again. The believers, they suffer in tribulation, they bear the cross. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, there it is again. We're not to deny Christ, we have to deny ourselves. The church has to deny itself, and then it finds Christ. If we deny him, he also will deny us. Hebrews chapter 10 verse 32. After ye endured a great fight of affliction. Now, of course, in a historical account, these verses had meaning also, but keep in mind that for the most part, God is using these verses here, I believe, twofold. We have to see the gospel in them as well, because the Bible is not just a book of history, it is the living word of God, and so Lord willing, it is always current event. So ultimately it ties into the what God is doing with the kingdom. Hebrews 12:7, if ye endure chastening. And you see that again, getting the same picture of the believers. They had to endure chastisement, chastening, coming into the great tribulation. That I think would relate to bearing the cross. James 1:12, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Remember the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So blessed is the man that endureth tribulation, temptation, trial. When he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life. There it is again. The crown of life is a time when the believers, now they begin to see Christ face to face. How? Well, through the Bible, right? As God unseals it. 1 Peter 2:20, for what glory is it if when ye be buffeted for your faults ye take it patiently? But if when ye do well and suffer, ye take it patiently. Now the believers, they've been redeemed, right? They've been sealed. And so they're not, even though they're being chastised in tribulation, they take it patiently, and therefore they God allows them to come out of tribulation. This is acceptable with God. James chapter 5 verse, no, we have sound here. It's still good. Rose might be losing sound again. Ask her if she can maybe refresh if she's not hearing the sound. Just leave and come back. That might help. James chapter 5 verse 11. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord. Now, who is Job? Who do you suppose Job is typifying? Very interesting account in the book of Job. The fact that he was afflicted, and then he lost everything, and in the end, because he endured, he did not deny Christ. Remember, his wife said, curse God and die, and that did not happen. And then in the end, God gave him twice as much as he had before. So Job, I think, is really a picture of the elect enduring affliction again in a time of tribulation. Okay, now the final section here. What happens when God brings the believers out of Babylon? Salvation. The body does not remain on the cross under a curse all night. And the word night or midnight is often synonymous to what? Tribulation. The night cometh when no man can work. At midnight there was a cry made, behold, the bridegroom cometh. So let's look at Deuteronomy 21:22 again. If a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain upon the tree all night. I have to break it up. For he that is hanged on a tree is accursed of God. Spiritually, again, I think this is pointing to the church and tribulation. And then we read, and what I offered before is that burial, to be buried with Christ. What about the unsaved? Isn't there a burial that is associated with the unsaved? Now, you know, I think we have to be careful, because when God speaks of burial in the context of salvation, who has to do the burial? Who has to bury whom? Don't we read in Matthew chapter 8 verse 22, let the dead bury the dead, right? Let the dead bury the dead. So wouldn't that be a picture of God allowing the church to destroy the church? But if God is the one who does the burial, the believers, the elect, they are buried with Christ by baptism. Romans chapter 6 verse 4. Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Genesis 47 verse 30. And I think again this is a language of salvation. But I, that's Jacob, will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt. And to leave Egypt spiritually would be pointing to what? Salvation again. The Exodus, coming out of bondage, captivity. And bury me in their burying place. So when God speaks of those that are buried with their fathers, especially if we read this language about Jacob, it is the language of salvation, I believe. And then John 19 verse 31, almost done. The Jews therefore besought that, because it was a preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath. Now, I think we've talked about Sabbath also, because there is the Sabbath of the 6-day Sabbath, right? Where the church comes into the Great Tribulation. Pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath. And then God speaks of the Sabbath again from the vantage point of what? The separation. God speaks of the Sabbath. And God changed when Christ was resurrected, Matthew 28 verse 1, and the end of the Sabbath, all the Old Testament Sabbath, the 7-day Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first of the Sabbaths, plural. So the historical account, God changed the Sabbath, but spiritually, again, I think we can make a tie in there to the Great Tribulation. When the body is resurrected, Christ is revealed. Now it's the first day of the week. It's the resurrection. Interesting picture, I think. Okay, so the body should not remain upon the cross. And we said that to be on the cross is to be accursed of God. The church is cursed in tribulation. Now the believers, God is going to make provision for their redemption, for their salvation. And so that body is going to be redeemed. It's not going to remain all night. That is, endure the full brunt of the dark days of tribulation. They're not going to come under the wrath of God. They're not going to suffer the second death. God buries the body. Salvation, right? He buries the body. And this, I think, ties in Psalm 16 verse 10, for thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Hell also identifies with the Great Tribulation. And then the believers, they are redeemed. Jacob is saved out of trouble. Matthew 24 verse 22, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. Now can you see again, when we try to relate this language to everything else the Bible is teaching, if we isolate this verse from the rest of the Bible and not try to pick up the overall thread, then it's easy to conclude, I think, that God is saying here that except the day should be shortened, then there would be no salvation, that is individually. And that's what I used to think. Until we begin to see that the redemption, the salvation of the body, the burial, after the believers endure the cross, is that God is going to deliver them from Babylon. And that too is salvation. So except those days, that's the days of the Great Tribulation, should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Now, I just want to share one additional observation. Maybe I can get some feedback to see what you think. In Matthew 27 verse 46, Christ going to the cross was under the wrath of God. The church coming in tribulation was under the wrath of God. Notice the language here where he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Do you suppose when we go to Matthew 7 verse 22, God is giving us a similar picture here, except in the context of the church? Many will say to me in that day, is that the last day? Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? My God, my God. This appears to be the cry of the body. Remember, this is parabolic language. And I don't think we have to anticipate necessarily a literal conversation, right? Is it possible that this is what the church is crying today? Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name have done many wonderful works. And then notice in verse 23, then will I profess unto them. Now this is when Christ is revealed, and by God's grace I think we do realize that this is spiritual. So we're not really looking at the very last day. So the fact that Christ will profess unto them is through the Bible. God unseals the Bible. Remember? So that now it is God who is speaking. Oh, wait a minute. Almost forgot. It is God who is speaking to the body. Then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Does that make sense? Okay, well, I thought that there might be an interesting connection there. So let me go ahead and just offer my conclusion on this, and then we'll open for correction or any questions you might have. The Bible appears to be equating bearing one's cross to the chastening of the elect in tribulation. Can we see that? To be hung on a tree is to be cursed of God. The church was spiritually on a cross and tribulation. The elect endured, and that they went through the fire. They went through the fire. However, their bodies would not remain all night on the cross. That is, they would not endure the second death. They come out of tribulation, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. So God redeems them. He visits them. He prophesied again and again that he would bring back their captivity. So the body, the corporate body, the believers being a part of his body, they will not remain all night on the cross, that is, under the wrath of God. Christ, having endured the cross, had already made payment for their sins. Okay, any questions on this? I'm not sure if this is hard to relate, the language of bearing the cross to the Great Tribulation. But by God's grace, I think there's a lot of information there that in the past we may not have considered. Okay, is the sound good? Are we still on? Okay, Thomas. All right, hold on one second. Great. Let me turn off the recorder for this session, and then we can open for a discussion. Ronnie has a question. Okay, hold on one second. Well, this is related to the study. Let me. What question is this? Which verse? Matthew 7. Right. Why hast thou forsaken me? God forsook Christ. Yeah. Christ was forsaken. Yeah. In a time when God was judging him. And we know that the Great Tribulation and the revelation of Christ is the judgment now on the church. So what is the follow-up there? Yeah. Those that are saying, and also I think there's another verse where God says, not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord. Wouldn't Matthew 7 be saying that the non-believing body would be saying those things and being in error, or those that do iniquity? And Christ was without iniquity. And yeah, I think that you're correct. It is pointing to the non-believing body. Absolutely. That's what I believe is in view. As God unseals the Bible today, he doesn't have to literally be speaking to them. It is through the unsealing of the Bible that God is making these things known. That's what I believe is in view there, Lord willing. Okay, bear with me one second.